At dinner my son-in-law raised his wine glass and looked straight at me. Then he asked loudly, so the entire table could hear. "Tell me something, Robert, how does it feel to be a loser?" For a second no one moved. Then one of the investors laughed. The other one followed. It wasn't polite laughter. It was the kind people use when they think the joke is obvious. Across the table my daughter Emily stared down at her plate. She didn't defend me. She didn't even look up. That silence told me everything. Daniel Mercer, my son-in-law, leaned back in his chair, clearly pleased with himself. He loved moments like this. An expensive restaurant. Important investors. And an easy target. We were sitting in Larkspur, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. Crystal glasses. Quiet music. Waiters moving like shadows. Daniel had chosen the place carefully. Tonight wasn't just dinner. It was a performance. The two men sitting across from him were venture capital partners considering a massive investment in his fintech company, Novaledger. To them Daniel was a rising star. A brilliant founder. A man building the future. And I was just the old man at the table. A retired civil engineer who had spent 40 years designing highways and bridges. Daniel swirled the wine in his glass and smiled again. "You spent your whole life working safe government jobs," he said. "No risks. No ambition. Just stability." The investors chuckled. Daniel lifted his glass slightly. "Some people build the future," he continued. "And some people just sit back and watch." Then he looked at me again. "So I'll ask one more time. How does it feel to be a loser?" The table waited for my reaction. Daniel expected embarrassment. Maybe anger. Instead, I smiled. Calmly. Then I leaned forward just slightly and spoke quietly enough that everyone had to listen. "Daniel," I said. "How does it feel knowing that this loser just decided to stop financing your company?" The laughter died instantly. The investor holding his glass froze mid-sip. The other one slowly turned toward Daniel. Because the one thing Daniel Mercer had never bothered to understand was that the quiet old man he loved to mock was the person who controlled the investment fund that had been keeping Novaledger alive for the last 3 years. And at that exact moment, I had just decided that the money was gone. For several seconds no one at the table spoke. The quiet was so sudden it felt unnatural. A moment earlier there had been laughter. Now there was only the soft sound of glasses touching the table. One of the investors slowly lowered his wine. The other leaned back slightly in his chair and looked at Daniel. Not at me. At Daniel. And that was when I saw the first crack appear in my son-in-law's confidence. Daniel Mercer had always been excellent at control. Control of conversations. Control of attention. Control of the image he presented to the world. But this moment had slipped outside his script. He forced a laugh. Too loud. Too quick. "Oh come on," Daniel said, waving his hand dismissively. "Robert is joking." No one laughed. The investor on the left, his name was Greg Lawson, tilted his head slightly. "Is he?" he asked calmly. Daniel's smile tightened. "Of course," he said. "Robert doesn't finance Novaledger." Greg's eyes moved to me. "Is that correct, Mr. Turner?" I said calmly. "Robert Turner." The second investor, Michael Harding, spoke for the first time. "And you're saying you currently finance part of the company?" Daniel interrupted quickly. "He doesn't," he said. I simply reached for my glass of water. I took a slow sip. Then I looked at Michael Harding. "For the last 3 years," I said, "Novaledger has received a series of private capital injections through Turner Strategic Holdings." Michael's eyebrows lifted slightly. Greg Lawson turned to Daniel again. That name appears in your financial overview, he said slowly. Daniel's jaw tightened. Minor seed capital, he said quickly. Very small. I smiled faintly. Almost half the money keeping Nova Ledger alive, comes from me. The silence returned. This time it was heavier. Greg Lawson leaned back in his chair. And if Mr. Turner stops financing? Daniel answered too quickly. He won't. That was when I gently placed my napkin on the table. I already have. Greg Lawson's fingers slowly tapped the edge of the table. Michael Harding looked down briefly at his phone. Then back at Daniel. You told us Nova Ledger was fully funded through Q4, he said. Daniel opened his mouth. Closed it again. For the first time that evening. Daniel Mercer had no speech prepared. Across the table my daughter finally looked up. Her face had gone pale. Dad, she said quietly. But Daniel stood up abruptly. Gentlemen, he said quickly, forcing confidence back into his voice, this is clearly a misunderstanding. Greg Lawson didn't move. Instead, he slowly closed the folder in front of him. The soft sound of paper sliding against leather seemed louder than the music in the restaurant. Daniel, he said calmly. We were just told that nearly half of the liquidity keeping your company running comes from someone you described as irrelevant. He paused. Then looked Daniel directly in the eyes. That concerns us. The room felt colder. Michael Harding pushed his chair back slightly. I think we should pause this conversation, he said. Greg Lawson nodded once. Then he slid Daniel's business proposal across the table. The folder stopped directly in front of him. Daniel, he said quietly. This meeting is over. Those words landed harder than any shout could have. The investors stood and left the table without another word. Daniel didn't move for several seconds. Then he slowly turned toward me. The smile was gone now. Completely. You think that was clever, he said quietly. His voice had changed. No more performance. Only anger. Emily grabbed his arm. Daniel, please, she whispered. He pulled his arm away. You just destroyed a $10 million investment round, he said. I stood up slowly. No, I said calmly. I simply stopped pretending your company was stable. Daniel stepped closer. You don't understand what you just did. I looked at him steadily. Oh, I understand perfectly. Then I put on my coat. Good night, Daniel. I left the restaurant without looking back. The cold air outside felt surprisingly calm. Almost peaceful. But I hadn't even reached the end of the street when my phone began vibrating in my pocket. Emily. I already knew what the conversation would sound like. I answered. Dad, what did you do? She said immediately. Her voice was shaking. You embarrassed Daniel in front of his investors. I stopped walking. That's what concerns you? I asked quietly. You could have handled that privately, she continued. You didn't have to ruin the deal. The word deal hung in the air between us. Not respect. Not family. The deal. I closed my eyes for a moment. Then I said the only honest thing left. You chose your side tonight, Emily. There was silence on the phone. Dad. I ended the call. The streetlights reflected on the wet pavement as I continued walking. For years I had ignored Daniel's arrogance. For years I had tolerated the quiet disrespect. Because of Emily. Because I believed family should survive uncomfortable truths. But that illusion had ended tonight. And if Daniel Mercer believed the worst part of his evening had already happened, he was about to discover just how wrong he was. Because tomorrow morning, I was going to call my financial advisor and begin asking questions about exactly what Daniel Mercer had been doing with my money. I barely slept that night. Not because of Daniel. And not because of the ruined dinner. What kept replaying in my mind was Emily's voice on the phone. Not the anger. Not even the accusation. It was the word she kept repeating. The deal. As if the most important thing that had happened that night wasn't Daniel humiliating me in front of a room full of investors. It was that I had disrupted a business opportunity. That word stayed with me long after the call ended. Because Daniel's reaction at the restaurant had bothered me in a way I couldn't fully explain. It wasn't just anger. It was panic. And panic rarely appears without a reason. The next morning I made a phone call. Her name was Laura Bennett, and she had managed my financial investments for almost 15 years. Laura was one of the very few people who understood exactly how the Turner Family Trust operated. She answered on the second ring. "Robert, good morning." Her voice was calm and professional. "I need a favor," I said. "That already sounds expensive," she replied lightly. "This one won't cost you anything." A short pause. "What do you need?" "I want a complete report on every dollar that has moved from Turner Strategic Holdings into Novaledger." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "That's specific," Laura said carefully. "I know. Is there a reason?" "Yes." I walked slowly toward the kitchen window. "Last night I stopped financing Daniel's company." Another pause. "Longer this time." "I see," she said. And something about his reaction didn't feel right." Laura didn't answer immediately. She never rushed decisions. That was one of the reasons I trusted her. "Give me a few hours," she said finally. "I'll review the records." It was nearly noon when my phone rang again. This time Laura didn't sound casual. "Robert," she said, "I've started looking through the financial reports. And there's something unusual." My grip on the phone tightened slightly. "How unusual?" "For the past 3 years," she said, "your capital injections have been keeping Novaledger operational." That part one no. "Yes," she said. "But the numbers Daniel shows investors don't match the internal cash flow." I said nothing. She continued. "The investor presentations show stable revenue growth. But the internal numbers tell a very different story." "How different?" I asked. Laura exhaled slowly. "Without your funding, the company would have run out of cash months ago." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "So Novaledger isn't stable?" "No," she said. "It's surviving." There was a short pause. Then Laura added something that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "And there's another issue." "What kind of issue?" "I found several investor presentations Daniel used over the last year." "What about them?" "They described the Turner Family Trust as a strategic financial partner." I frowned. "That's not accurate." "No," Laura said quietly. "It isn't." I sat down at the kitchen table. "What exactly do those presentations say?" "They strongly suggest your money guarantees Novaledger's stability." My jaw tightened. "He's been telling investors my capital backs the company." "Yes. And if investors believe that?" Laura finished the sentence. "They assume the company can't fail." The silence in my kitchen suddenly felt very heavy. "Laura," I said slowly, "have I ever signed anything guaranteeing Daniel's company?" "Absolutely not." "Are those documents legally binding?" "No. But they create the impression that you stand behind the business." I stared at the table for a long moment. "So Daniel has been using my name to secure investor confidence?" "Yes. And if that confidence disappears? Novaledger collapses." I leaned back in the chair. For years I had tolerated Daniel's arrogance. But arrogance was something you could ignore. This was something else. This was deception. "Laura," I said quietly, I want a full forensic review of Novoledger's finances. That's a serious step. I'm aware. She hesitated. Robert, if Daniel has been misleading investors, this could turn into a legal situation. What kind of legal situation? Another pause. The kind where investors start asking who knew about it. The implication was clear. If Daniel's investors lost money, they might start looking at me. Understood, I said. Laura was silent for a moment. Then she said something that changed everything. Robert, there's something else you should know. What? I found a document Daniel used in several investor meetings. What kind of document? A letter of financial commitment. My stomach tightened. And? It states that the Turner Family Trust intends to invest $5 million into Novoledger's next funding round. I felt my pulse slow. Laura, I said quietly. I never signed anything like that. I know. Another pause. Then she said the words that turned suspicion into certainty. Robert, the document includes your signature. The room suddenly felt very quiet. My signature? Yes. Is it real? No. Her voice was calm. Certain. It's a forgery. For several seconds I said nothing. Outside the kitchen window the street looked exactly the same as it had every other morning. Quiet. Ordinary. But inside my mind something had shifted. Daniel Mercer hadn't just been using my money. He had been using my name. My reputation. And now possibly my signature. Laura, I said finally. Yes. How many investors have seen that document? Her answer came quietly. More than you'd probably like. I ended the call a few minutes later. Then I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The truth was beginning to form a much darker picture than I had expected. Daniel Mercer hadn't simply built a company. He had built a story. A story where my money guaranteed success. A story investors were willing to believe. And now that story was starting to fall apart. But one question still remained. If Daniel had already forged my signature once, what else had he been signing? In my name. 2 days passed before Daniel called. Not Emily. Daniel. I knew the moment I saw his name on my phone that something had changed. Daniel Mercer never called me. Not unless he needed something. I answered. Yes. His voice came through the speaker tight and controlled. We need to talk. Not can we talk. We need to talk. That alone told me how desperate the situation had become. About what? I asked calmly. You know exactly what this is about. I waited. Daniel exhaled slowly. The investors from Larkspur called me this morning. I said nothing. They're concerned. Concerned. That was a polite way of saying they no longer trusted him. And? I asked. And you created that problem. There it was. Blame. Daniel always needed someone else to blame. You humiliated me in front of them, he continued. I corrected a misunderstanding. You sabotaged a $15 million investment. No, I said quietly. You sabotaged it when you built your company on promises you couldn't keep. The silence on the line lasted several seconds. Then Daniel spoke again. This isn't a phone conversation. Then what is it? I'm coming over. Before I could respond, the line went dead. 40 minutes later Daniel's car pulled into my driveway. Emily stepped out first. Her face looked pale. Daniel followed behind her. His movements were sharp and impatient. He didn't wait to be invited inside. He walked directly into the living room like a man entering a place he already owned. Emily stayed near the door. Daniel dropped a thick folder onto the coffee table. The sound echoed through the quiet room. "What is this?" I asked. "Paperwork." "For what?" "A bridge loan." I almost smiled. The irony was impossible to ignore. He had spent years mocking my career building bridges. Now he needed one. "How much?" I asked. 5 million. The number hung in the air. Emily looked at me. Her eyes were filled with something close to panic. "Dad," she said softly, "Daniel just needs temporary liquidity." Liquidity. Another polite word. Daniel leaned forward. "Oak Ridge Capital meets with us in 6 days," he said. "If that meeting goes well, we secure the Series B round." 15 million, I said. "Yes." "And if it doesn't?" Daniel didn't answer. Because we both knew the answer. Novaledger would collapse. He slid the folder closer to me. "This guarantees stability," he said. I didn't touch it. "What exactly does it say?" "That Turner Strategic Holdings will provide a temporary capital guarantee." I looked at the document. The language was carefully written. Very carefully. If I signed it, I would become personally responsible for Novaledger's financial survival. "Daniel," I said calmly, "why would investors believe you needed a guarantee?" His jaw tightened. "Startups require flexibility." "That's not what I asked." Emily stepped forward. "Dad, please." Her voice trembled. "This isn't about pride." "No," I said quietly. "It isn't." I finally picked up the document. And there it was. At the bottom of the page. A signature line. Waiting. For my name. Robert Turner. I looked up at Daniel. "Interesting," I said. "What?" "This is the same amount you promised investors last month." Daniel froze. Emily blinked. "What are you talking about?" she asked. I turned the document slightly toward Daniel. $5 million, I said calmly. "The same number that appears in the commitment letter you showed investors." The color slowly drained from Daniel's face. "Dad," Emily said quietly, "what commitment letter?" Daniel spoke quickly. "He doesn't know what he's talking about." I ignored him. "Emily," I said gently, "your husband showed investors a document claiming my trust would invest $5 million in Novaledger." Her eyes widened. "Daniel?" He didn't answer. Instead he looked at me. And in that moment the mask finally dropped. "Fine," he said. "So what if I did?" Emily stared at him. "You told them Dad already agreed?" Daniel shrugged. "It helped move the negotiations forward." "That's fraud," I said quietly. Daniel laughed. "No, Robert. That's business." I studied his face carefully. For the first time I understood something important. Daniel Mercer didn't believe he had done anything wrong. In his mind. This was simply how successful people operated. Emily's voice broke the silence. "Daniel, you said everything was secure." "It will be," he said quickly. He pointed at the document in my hands. "As soon as he signs that." Both of them looked at me. One with desperation. The other with expectation. I placed the document back on the table. "No." Daniel's expression hardened instantly. "You don't understand the consequences." "Oh," I said quietly. "I understand them perfectly." He leaned closer. "If Novaledger collapses, investors are going to ask questions." "I hope they do." His eyes narrowed. "You think they'll blame me?" "I know they will." For several seconds Daniel didn't move. Then he picked up the folder and slammed it shut. "You'll regret this," he said. "Maybe." But as I watched him storm out of my house, dragging Emily behind him, I realized something important. Daniel Mercer still believed he was in control. He thought the upcoming meeting with Oak Ridge Capital was his last chance to save his company. What he didn't realize was that the meeting had already become something else entirely. Because in 6 days, when Daniel Mercer walked into that boardroom expecting $15 million, he wasn't going to face investors. He was going to face the truth. The boardroom at Oak Ridge Capital was exactly what you would expect from a firm that managed billions. Glass walls, a long black conference table, and a view of the city that made every person inside feel slightly more powerful than they really were. Daniel Mercer stood at the front of the room. Confident. Relaxed. Back in his natural environment. A large screen behind him displayed the Novoledger logo. 3 partners from Oak Ridge Capital sat across the table. Among them were Greg Lawson and Michael Harding. The same 2 investors from the restaurant. Daniel was halfway through his presentation. And with the continued strategic support of Turner Strategic Holdings, he said smoothly, Novoledger is positioned for aggressive expansion in the next fiscal year. Greg Lawson said nothing. But he exchanged a brief look with Michael Harding. Daniel didn't notice. Or pretended not to. He clicked the remote and the slide changed. Projected revenue curves climbed upward across the screen. The kind of graph that investors love to see. The stability of our financial backing, Daniel continued, gives us the confidence to scale rapidly. That was when the door opened. Not loudly. Just enough to interrupt the rhythm of the room. Daniel turned. His expression changed the moment he saw me. Not anger. Not surprise. Something closer to disbelief. Robert, he said slowly. Behind me stood Laura Bennett. And beside her, a tall man in a dark suit. My attorney, David Klein. The room went very quiet. Greg Lawson leaned back slightly. Well, he said calmly. This should be interesting. Daniel forced a laugh. Robert, this is a private meeting. Yes, I said. I'm aware. I walked slowly toward the table. David Klein placed a thin folder in front of each investor. No logos. No branding. Just documents. Greg Lawson opened the first folder. Michael Harding followed. The 3rd partner did the same. Daniel remained standing. What is this? He demanded. No one answered him. The investors were reading. And for the first time that morning, I felt the weight of what could happen next. If those men believed Daniel instead of me, my name could be dragged into a fraud I had never committed. Everything my wife and I had built could collapse in a matter of minutes. But the truth was already on the table. And now it was reading itself aloud. The first page was a notarized statement from Turner Strategic Holdings. It confirmed that the company had no current or future financial commitment to Novoledger. The second page was a copy of the document Daniel had shown investors. The forged commitment letter. The $5 million guarantee. And attached to it was the final page. A report from a forensic handwriting analyst. The conclusion was short. Clear. And devastating. The signature was fraudulent. Greg Lawson closed the folder slowly. Michael Harding placed his hands on the table. The 3rd partner simply stared at Daniel. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally Greg Lawson looked up. Not at me. At Daniel. Is this accurate? He asked. Daniel's mouth opened. But no words came out. He tried again. It's being taken out of context. Michael Harding spoke next. You presented this letter as proof of financial backing. Daniel shook his head quickly. It was a preliminary discussion. That's not what you told us. Daniel looked around the room. For help. For support. There was none. I finally spoke. Mr. Lawson, I said calmly. I felt it was important to clarify that my trust has never committed $5 million to Novaledger. The silence that followed was absolute. Greg Lawson closed the folder. Then he pushed Daniel's business proposal across the table. Back toward him. "Daniel," he said quietly. "This meeting is over." No raised voice. No anger. Just finality. Daniel stood frozen. For the first time since I had known him. He understood the game was finished. David Klein gathered the remaining documents. Laura Bennett stood beside me. And I turned toward the door. As we walked out of the boardroom, I could feel Daniel's eyes on my back. The doors closed behind us with a soft click. Inside that room, a company was collapsing. Outside, the hallway felt strangely calm. Laura exhaled slowly. "Well," she said. "That was decisive." "Yes," I replied. But the story wasn't over yet. Because somewhere behind those glass walls, Daniel Mercer was beginning to understand something that had taken me weeks to see. His company hadn't been destroyed by investors. Or by bad markets. Or by competition. It had been destroyed. The moment he decided that the quiet man at the dinner table was too insignificant to notice what he was doing. And the truth sitting in those 3 investor folders was already moving far beyond that boardroom. The next place Daniel Mercer would have to explain his lies would not be to investors. It would be to federal investigators. 3 weeks later the story finally reached the newspapers. Not the front page. Just a quiet column in the business section. Novaledger CEO under investigation for financial misrepresentation. The article was short. Clinical. Brutal. The investment deal had collapsed within hours of the Oak Ridge meeting. Within days, the Securities Commission opened an investigation. Daniel Mercer's company unraveled faster than anyone expected. Investors withdrew. Creditors called in their loans. Employees began leaving. The company that had once been valued at $80 million was now little more than a shell. I read the article in the quiet of my kitchen. For a long moment I simply stared at the screen. Not with satisfaction. Not with anger. Just with a strange sense of calm. A life built on lies always collapses eventually. Sometimes it just needs a small push. That afternoon my phone rang. Jessica. Her voice was nothing like the confident woman from the restaurant. It was small. Fragile. "Dad." "I didn't know," she said quietly. I believed him. I didn't answer right away. Through the window I could see the tomato plants in my garden. Carol used to say you could tell the quality of soil by the way tomatoes grew. Rich soil produced strong fruit. Poor soil produced weak roots. "Jessica," I said finally. "You chose the life you wanted." "I know," she whispered. There was a long silence between us. "Can we start over?" she asked. I looked at the garden again. At the simple things Carol and I had built together. Starting over was never about money. It was about choices. "Maybe," I said. "But this time you'll have to build something real." She didn't argue. She just said, "I understand." After the call ended, I went outside and watered the garden. The sun was setting. The air smelled like soil and summer. And for the first time in a long while, the world felt quiet again. Because in the end, the truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs time. Thank you for listening. Calm justice doesn't shout. It keeps records.